Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Craven from the NET English Director Team, and I'm here with Mrs. Potts, Mr. Kofi and Mrs. Garbutt, also from the Director Team. And today we're going to be talking about Blake's poem, London. So just to start us off, why is this an interesting, or at least a useful poem, do you think? I don't know, Mrs. Potts, do you want to dive in with that one?
Yeah. This poem, in my opinion, is that it is an actual conflict, but not a military conflict, so it's a conflict between people.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got the voice of the poet who is aware of all of these problems in society, and he is voicing that concern. And we see the poor instantly powerless and kind of stuck in this continuous cycle of negativity.
So really uplifting stuff for a Friday afternoon. Good stuff. I mean, you mentioned Blake there in terms of the poet. I mean, Mr. Kofi, do you want to, who is Blake? Is he relevant, do you think?
Yeah, I think he is. For me, I would argue that this might be more of a nature poem, from the sense of, so the fact that he's a romantic poet, the fact that romantics believed in the transcendent power of nature, and how mankind without nature is flawed and requires.
Yeah, because he's on the social side of the romantic poets, isn't he? I mean, he's early romantic. He's often viewed, isn't he, as kind of like the founding father, because he's just before Wordsworth and Shelley and that sort of that sort of group. He's writing. He does focus on those urban issues, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But he has that kind of social conscience side of it.
Yeah, and a lot of his other poetry, very aware of social issues, wants to write about that. And if you think about him being a contemporary of Wordsworth, who wrote the Prelude, you can see very similar ideas between the two poems, and you probably could in that sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything about him on a personal level, do you think? I mean, geographically, he was London-based, wasn't he? I think
so. Yeah, absolutely.
An engraver as well, wasn't he?
Yes.
So you can sort of bring up images of these things. He did see them as being very, very much a visual form, didn't he? Although the poems are word-based, in actual fact, alongside the engraved image. And to work like that.
Yeah, he self-published them, didn't he? So,
he did, yeah. Never particularly successfully, I believe, actually.
No.
Yeah. So in terms of the situation around London, then, the context about the poem, I mean, Mrs. Garbutt, is there anything you think in terms of the social aspects, in terms of what's happening in society? Or the
system?
I
think what we really can pull out from the poem is that Blake's discussed in the organ, particularly when we're thinking about royalty and we're thinking about the politics at that time, and we can see how he really emphasises how disappointed he is, because he can see how the lower classes are being left alone and being abandoned by society. So again, those organisations are being brought through constantly.
Or even worse, exploited in terms of the...
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So, and again, just really to show his fear, if people don't change, how this will continue.
Yeah. So where do we see that, do you think? I mean, open question to anybody, really. Where do we see these organisations, these institutions, which are failing society? Where do you think we see that in the poem?
The third stanza mentions the church,
the blackening,
and the palace. And I think Blake he's got an issue with institutionalised religion.
Yeah. Yes.
Spirituality's got no problem with, if you read his other poetry, but it's the institution of the church and the way it uses power and its corruption. Same with the palace, the idea of the soldier's size, the soldier being a common man, the chimney sweeper's a common man, and how they're blood walls, so the people making the decisions for the soldiers are the ones who aren't actually affected. It's the common people who are affected. It's that hypocrisy that he seems to be protesting against.
They're the blackening church. I love that as an interpretive point, isn't it? Because in terms of the blackening aspect, it is making things worse, isn't it? It's getting worse itself. It is becoming blacker itself. It is blackening. But also the literal aspect with blackening of industrialisation and just the stone walls becoming polluted. And that sort of
absolutely.
Thing. Yeah.
Again, thinking about that religious connotation as well, because we would always associate the lightning with the church, and then that would be hope. Whereas we can see how they're showing that how they've, with that neglect from that charity side.
Yeah,
I also think with that repetition of charted in the first two lines in the first stanza, how the lower classes are being controlled as well by the organisations.
You find some very odd interpretations of chartered. I often find that people just sort of fudge it and pretend they understand and then just don't define it. So I mean, everybody wants to kind of leap in with, I mean, what does he mean by chartered street, chartered Thames? Why is...
Well, my interpretation is those chartered streets and the chartered Thames shows that really thinking about the government as that overview, and everyone is aware of where they are in society, and they realise that they don't have that freedom. And really, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about the lower classes at this point in time.
Well, it's a question of ownership, isn't it? If you're a middle class or upper class person, if you're wealthy, you can control these things, and especially with the street and the Thames. I don't know about you guys.
I was just going to say the contrast. Because the Thames, and it's that present tense where the Thames is free, and it's that idea what you were talking about with regards to the power of nature.
She's pointing towards Mr. Kofi now.
You
can't see the hands.
So the idea that nature has got that reverence and that freedom, and it's actually the most vulnerable people in society who are of these establishments.
And the
church
Thames,
and the
yeah,
palace.
and the Thames, the river and the street also. If anything should be free, a place where people move and walk and trade and interact, and the Thames as well. You know, this is water they would use for cooking and cleaning. You know, and transport as well, wouldn't they? You know, it's fundamental to every part of life in London. Is there as a city, in actual fact, isn't it? And trade and so
Everything's
on.
built around it.
And yet, it's being limited and controlled simply really to oppress the lower classes and benefit from that kind of oppression and exploitation.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Interesting. Now, the Blood and Palace Walls thing, just to pick up on that, in terms of, is there anything about the context you think relevant to do with that as well? I mean, you mentioned the idea of the soldiers and foreign wars going on. I'm thinking sort of across on the continent at this point. Oh, interesting. Right, the French Revolution.
I was just going to say it's
Yes,
France, isn't it?
it is. Because lots of the Romantics, I mean, Wordsworth, for example, was a massive fan, wasn't he, of the French Revolution and that sort of thing. At least the early version. Later edition, I think he had problems with the violence involved. But the Blood and Palace Walls are like a threat to the upper classes. If you do not solve these problems, the same thing will happen to you.
Yes, yeah.
Do you think that's a fair interpretation? Am I?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Most definitely.
for me, it's one of the killer quotations. I think you'd be absolutely mad to not include that quotation in an essay that you were writing about London.
With reference to blood, also quite a nice pun there with the killer quotation.
Yeah,
yes.
definitely.
Very good, yeah.
But that idea between the classes, isn't it?
Things
It's
separate them
protected
off.
and it's the
Yes.
exposed. And
Absolutely.
the fact that I always comment on the fact that runs is plural. This is going to continue to happen unless something stops it.
Absolutely. To turn then into, I mean, so students often view this poem as very, very simply. It's just a poem about someone walking through the streets of London. And is that right? Is that too limited? Is that, you know, how do you respond to that?
I would say it starts off appearing that, and you've got William Blake who he's aware of it, he listens to it, he can see it, but it's a social criticism. He
Yeah.
wants a change in society.
I think because that's what he's doing, is he's giving a voice to the voiceless. So
Yes.
he's exactly what Miss just said there. He's listening and he's seeing and he's actually walking around. He's woke, isn't he? He can see what's happening.
Yes,
so
he's very
yes,
woke.
yeah.
Yes,
Very woke.
absolutely.
For this time.
For the
period.
time, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose one of the interesting things is obviously as a resident of London, this is London, this city he knows. So this is kind of, we assume his own voice he's recording it in. At the same time, though, I think in terms of the way he's written it, it does reflect that idea of the walking, doesn't it? I don't know if you think the same.
Definitely.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well the way it's structured
Yes.
is meant to reflect the structure around the people as well. So the four lines being started is reflecting how the people feel with the mind-forged manacles.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
Yeah.
entrapped by the very city that's meant to free them from, meant to be liberation from poverty, isn't it?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it ends up being the thing that actually holds them in
Yeah.
poverty.
Yes. And interesting, I think, also in terms of the structure of the poem. I mean, he had this very strong rhythm all the way through. You know, iambic, de-dum, de-dum, de-dum. And the rhyme scheme as well, this ABA rhyme scheme, the cross-rhyming that he uses in his quatrains. And it feels like someone's walking around the city, doesn't it? You
Definitely.
have that sense of that pace of walking around, that smooth, even, steady pace. But also then the structure of these stanzas. I mean, I've had a question from students before about why it's in these stanzas and why in that order. I don't know if you...
I think it's really important the fact that he ends, and I know I'm going backwards here, but he ends with the youth.
Yes,
And because they've been born into this situation,
absolutely.
and if something does not change,
That vicious cycle.
that cycle
Absolutely.
of negativity is going
Yes.
to
Yeah.
continue.
The street, doesn't he, in the river. It's his point of view. Here's where he is. Then you get the sounds of the people around. He's looking beyond that, isn't he, to the people around him. And then he goes beyond that. And Ms. Garbutt, as you were saying, in terms of those institutions, those the buildings, looking beyond them to the bigger things beyond them.
Yeah.
And then the last stanza, the midnight streets, and it's almost like it goes beyond those big things that people ignore and pretend isn't there. And that sense of of hypocrisy,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Absolutely. And going back really to what Miss was saying as well about the youth, and I do think it's really significant in stanza 2 when we have that repetition in every cry, in every man, in every infant's cry of fear. And again, it's reminding us again about how the inability of them to be able to how it's going to be limited, and yet he's aware of this, and why aren't other people aware of this? And you can understand his frustration at that point in time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then in that second stanza, the fact that the first person who cries is the man.
Yes.
I know
That's
it's a
interesting.
metaphor for
Yes.
all of mankind, but we've got that masculine
But also the gender
figure,
aspect as well, yes,
the
yeah.
masculine element, and it's a cry. Then we've got the infant
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
crying out of fear, but also crying out of need.
Absolutely.
yeah.
And the chimney sweeper's cry, which
Yeah.
would be a child as well.
Yeah.
So we've got lots of
Ongoing.
reference to the youth who are moving on in the future.
Also,
However, will they
yeah.
have a future? Makes us question that.
Yeah.
And all reduced to the same sort of level.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
All down to kind of the common cry.
That's exactly what you said about sounds he's hearing. You can hear that every cry of every man. It sounds like a blacksmith's hammer. You know, the kind of industry, the sounds of industrialisation going on in the background of wherever he's walking.
And how it's inescapable. How William Blake can't escape the problems in society.
It's worth at that point picking up this idea of the mind. It's probably my go-to quotation. It's probably my favourite answer. So how do we interpret that? I mean, what is that, do we think?
Manacles means kind of handcuffs, doesn't it?
Yes.
Chains you. Yeah. So and forged means create, but it's also a very industrial term, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you forge things like a blacksmith would forge. So it's that idea, I suppose, well, for me, of the oppressed.
Yes, absolutely.
Trapped in the mind as well as kind of physically.
And what sort of ideas then do you think they are oppressed by? What are these mind-forged manacles?
Hope, really. They can't see any way out.
Yeah.
Like they've suffered for so long in this unforgiving society where they are so vulnerable in their soul, and they can't see anything other than that.
Yeah, I think. I agree with that. I think a lot of the oppression actually comes from the idea of who are you? You are working class. You are poor. That is your lot in life. That is who you are. You will never be better than that. Don't try to be. You just have to accept that.
Predestination.
Absolutely. And the idea of the religious aspect. Sorry, with the predestination, exactly as you said. Sorry, you can say.
No, I was just really links with the palace walls being a metaphorical barrier between the classes.
Absolutely, and it's a fixed point, isn't it? You know, but the religious thing with the predestination, the idea that the redemptive thing. If you are suffering, it's because God wants you to, but your reward will be in the afterlife.
Absolutely.
And the argument also from the church at this time in particular, that yes, we'll benefit from your money, we will become wealthy and powerful, and you will suffer, but that's good for you. And all it does is keep people in that place doing the same thing.
Yeah.
For the benefit of the clergy, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah, because I can't remember what the name of the person was, but there was a person at this time who mapped out London in terms of the poorest and richest areas, and black and gold. So which was the poorest, he coloured in black. Anywhere that was rich was gold. And what they noticed was the richest areas were right next to the poorest areas. So that idea of hypocrisy and that juxtaposition that you get all the way through of the chimney sweeper, the church, the soldier, the palace, the infant, the harlot. It's all about how the hypocrisy of you turn a corner, go from the richest area in London to the most poor, and how awful that is, and how hypocritical that is.
Yeah.
And it's got echoes to A Christmas Carol, particularly in
most
Save
definitely.
as well, where Scrooge is taken down
very
those
much so,
areas.
isn't it? Yes.
Most
And the
definitely.
hidden parts of London.
And it links
Yeah.
the remind when last stanza being the hidden parts of London, the parts that are being ignored. It's exactly those type of places that Dickens is make sure that the ghost
Kind of
takes
shining a
Scrooge
light on,
to
isn't
go
it,
and
Because
see.
he's chosen not to go there previously.
So the property map was Charles Booth,
That's right.
1886. So actually rather later than Blake's poem.
Right.
But yes, that kind of common idea.
period.
Interesting. So in terms then of the way he structured the poem, where do you think he arrives? So at the end of the poem, what's the point he's making? How does he draw it together in that final stanza, do you think?
That if nothing changes, the youth are going to die.
Yeah. This idea of the youthful harlot as well. I mean,
Yeah.
But
He's
also-
exploited as well.
absolutely, yes.
It's so emotive at that point.
And I think harlot also, I mean, you have those double interpretations, don't you? A bit like lots of modern words. It can literally mean prostitute,
Yes.
which probably it does mean, or it can mean someone who's sexually promiscuous, right? And either way, what he's criticising is the way that society exploits the weak, the working class, particularly women, particularly young women.
Yeah. I must admit, in the prostitute, it just really
Yes,
shows that
yeah.
desperation for survival, because
Absolutely.
for her to follow through that route, she must have been desperate to survive.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a constant reminder of the dreadful lack of choices for,
Yeah.
and again, a female at that point in time who doesn't have many opportunities.
And how do you interpret curse then? So what's curse? Because I know there's several ways of reading that.
You could look at it in terms of curses in kind of swearing or shouting, but
Foul language,
foul
lack of
language.
education. Yeah.
Yeah.
As
I
a
think
result of her
the
societal
social
standard.
role,
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
also, if you could look at the plagues, the curse and the plagues is quite almost kind of Old Testament language.
It's
that
very
would-
biblical,
that
yeah.
This is judgment for London because of the way that London is, and the hypocrisy, that this could be like God's judgment, or God's turned away from these streets, in the same way that the church has turned away from these people. And the sense of, you've got the harlot and the infant, almost like a cyclical thing. Like I always sometimes read that and going to end up being the harlot.
Being the same
Definitely.
thing, absolutely.
And I think the
Yeah.
key thing there is, if I was going to use that quotation, I would zoom in on the adjective youthful as well, because that's
Yes.
so important, because her youth has been taken away, she's been hardened by society.
It's very Edith
Yes.
Smith, isn't it? Really,
Yeah, it
actually,
is.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
As
Yes,
a
yes.
result,
It is.
like,
Yeah.
of surviving.
Yeah.
But then the newborn, which implications of innocence. This baby has no chance.
Yes.
This,
No.
this innocence is.
And there's also the argument, isn't there, that the youthful harlot's curse. The curse can also be metaphorical for her situation.
Yeah.
She's trapped in there.
She's
She's
trapped.
cursed, as in
Yes.
destined to be that, as is the infant. There's also the reading, isn't there, the idea that this is an STI, this is a sexually transmitted disease, which is massively widespread. There's very limited contraception at the time. And for me, that also links to the idea of the sorry, if you want to unpack that for me.
So the hearse is to do with death, isn't
Death.
it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
it
where you
is.
transport the dead body.
So having
yeah.
marriage and hearse together
Mm.
it shouldn't go together, should it? It's
No.
kind of
No.
contrast, or this sense of of doom, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes.
The marriage is dead. That kind of anything to do with godly things that are dead,
Absolutely.
and dying, and
So marriage is that unification of two people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and ending
Yeah.
on that word hearse kind of ends on that theme of death,
Yeah.
doesn't it? And
There's also the argument, isn't there, with the marriage hearse, the idea that, to go back to the disease thing,
Yeah.
right, that the disease can be so widespread and is so problematic, it's in quite a limited part of society because it's the men,
It's the men
isn't
who
it?
are
It's the
spreading
middle
the
class
disease.
men
Yes.
who are spreading the disease and interacting with prostitutes and so on, exploiting them. And of course, lots of women in the middle classes and upper classes, and even the working classes, keep themselves completely pure and innocent as they at the time are intended to. And yet they get married and are given these horrific diseases and suffer as a result, pass it on to the children that are produced through the marriage as well. Reception and understanding of these things at the time. Lots of the women then, go into childbirth, right, because, they're having lots and lots and lots of children with a very high mortality rate. And women are far more likely to die as a result of childbirth. So as a woman at this time getting married, you are, for a lot of the time, you're signing your own
Yeah.
death sentence, aren't you? And possibly that of your children as well.
And it's the idea that symbolic marriage is it's a new life, it's a new start. But the
Yes.
harsh reality is in this situation in William Blake's London.
Yes, oxymoronic.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's not.
Yes, absolutely. So I did have a question prepared, which is, do you think that Blake, because I came across this from a student, do you think he's advocating class warfare? Is he trying to encourage the working class to rise up, male, stale and male?
My initial answer to that is maybe not. Maybe I think at this point, the lower class people in this poem are presented as too powerless to be able to do that.
Yes.
And
I
I
agree.
think the way I interpreted it is that it's the people who they need to change first,
And in terms
and
of
they need to
literacy
accept social
and
responsibility.
education, they're the ones who would actually be reading the poem and understanding
I
it,
agree.
presumably.
And perhaps going back to what you said earlier as well about the ghosts taking Scrooge to those areas, it's a little bit like Blake is now allowing the organisations who are unaware of what they're doing
Yeah.
and to see the damage that they're doing to now reflect on what they're actually
So in terms of stumbling blocks, are there any tricky things to do with this poem, do you think? Anything that people tend to fall over?
I'm going to be honest, no, I think
No.
this is quite an accessible poem.
I think it's really straightforward, and I think as we said at the beginning of this, it's his journey, and we
Yes.
can follow.
And it's a great comparative poem as well.
So to unpack that then, so where would you go for a comparison? Should we go one at a time? Where
Yeah.
would you go? Miss Potts?
Checking out my history.
Interesting, why?
Power of an Individual. It's about, if you think about John Agard, the voice of the poet, he has been blinded at the start as a result of an institution, just like are blinded about the consequences of their actions. Main difference, at the end of the poem, John Agard is empowered because he then carves out his own history,
That choice acting for himself.
whereas
yes.
the victims in this poem, they're not empowered because they've got those mind-forged manacles on
Yes.
and they need help from
Because the mindful manacles is quite a nice link for that, the idea of this
The
imposed
bandage and the
worldview.
blind.
Yeah, being blinded by that.
Yeah.
I can see it. Well justified. Okay, Mr. Kofi, where do you go?
I just changed my mind at the last second.
Did you?
I was going to
okay.
go with the prelude, but I think I'm going to go Emigre.
I was going to go with Greg. Go on.
Just because it's about, in the Emigre you've got the speaker looking back at their past and that stuff about sunlight, even though they're aware that there are obviously issues in that place, being war-torn and so on, they choose to see the positivity of that, even though there's implications of the hollow doll, like it's empty.
Yes.
Whereas Blake is very much kind of, there's no positives whatsoever in London as he walks through it.
And you do have the idea of the city in both of them, the idea of children to actually affect their own lives.
Yeah, and innocence versus experience.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's a nice link.
It's quite neat. And light and dark even.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as well, you've got the kind of the idea of empowerment in the Emigre, because her memories and her nostalgia actually it makes her stronger,
They're
like
protective
internally.
things,
Yeah,
yes. Yes.
empowers her.
Absolutely.
I would go with Ozymandias,
Oh, lovely.
purely just because of the power, and I would just see how we can see those who are given that position of power are being seen as tyrants. Whether or not we were talking about Ozymandias or whether or not we're talking about, as we said, any of the organisations. So we can see how they abuse those ones who are lower class or a less privileged situation to those.
There's also quite the nice idea, isn't there, that in Ozymandias, there's the idea that power is a temporary thing, and the party at the end of it, it meant absolutely nothing. Whereas in here, with Blake, the idea that in London, the power has a long-term impact, and that cyclical repetition of these lives, the children's lives, and so on. So also quite a nice link.
Yeah, it's almost that Ozymandias does come to a really formal, blunt end, and there's just an end to this, whereas this, as you had mentioned earlier, Miss had said about like the Thames flowing, and it runs down Palace Walls, it's going to be continuing.
I always try and get my students to put in the phrase, if they're talking about Aussie in particular, the fact that man-made power is temporary, is permanent.
Yes.
You could flip that, because William Blake at the moment, I think he's putting across that the abuse of power of mankind, he doesn't see it as temporary, he sees the permanent, long-lasting effects on it.
Yes, nice idea, definitely. So, if you had to choose one quotation from it to take into an exam, what would you go for? Go other way around quotation.
I think my quotation personally would be, as we said earlier, the Mind Forge, Mind Forge here.
Yes, I agree.
It's one that we can always link to whichever question I think they're going to ask us, whether or not they're talking from power, we're talking about class, we can always bring that particular quote in as well.
Yeah, like it, definitely. Mr. Coffey?
Yeah, I mean, I would have chosen that one, but
you can't have that one.
No, fine. Soldier's sigh runs in blood down Palace Walls.
Is a neat one as well.
Yeah, they've got to be in there. I'm going to go for marks of weakness, marks of war.
Oh, interesting.
From the perspective that these are physical marks and they can see on the victims, but actually they symbolise the internal scarring of the consequences of these people living in this society.
And the nice
so the marks are lasting forever.
But the verb and noun issue with mark and mark also, that you have to see that, you have to acknowledge that it's there.
And the fact that it's plural as well. Continuous, he doesn't just see one person with a mark, he sees everybody with a mark, but then you can also interpret that everybody's got multiple marks of weakness.
But it could also use lots of interpretations of marks, isn't there? Because it can be a mark in terms of kind of disease, but it could also be a mark in terms of branded, like the kind of marked by what they've seen, and they can't,
So as a personal favourite, I like the blackening church. I think so it's a nice little, neat little phrase, very memorable, very easy to
very easy
recall.
to remember.
Final question then. If you could design a dream question for the exam on this poem, what would it be?
Compare how Ports presents the ideas of powerlessness.
Yeah. I suppose because with powerlessness, you have automatically the flip side as well, don't you? You have the power and powerlessness.
Yes, that's really nice.
Yeah, that's quite neat.
I think I'd say compare how poets present humanity.
Yeah.
Because you've got quite a broad open question, and then you could bring nature in as well if you wanted to.
It's quite neat, yeah. I think also could work, couldn't it? Strength and weakness.
You could also
which is
have
kind of power and powerlessness, I suppose.
Conflict as well.
Yeah.
If you think about the past questions, they've predominantly been, how does a poet present power or conflict?
Yes.
Conflict between people.
Power of a place, possibly?
Yes.
Something along those lines. That would be a slightly cruel one. But
that's hard.
Yeah.
It's good to prepare for the cruel ones, though, isn't it?
Yeah, also a dream question, I suppose, Right, that's it for this podcast. Huge thanks to all the English directors for taking part. And as ever, do talk to your teachers, talk to members of the English director team if you have any questions, queries, comments or concerns. And thank you very much for listening.